This is In the Black, a leadership, strategy and business podcast brought to you by CPA Australia.
Welcome to the In the Black podcast. I'm Tan Sharp, editor of In the Black at CPA Australia. In this episode, we're diving into the topic of cognitive bias, which is often overlooked but deeply influential across so many professional sectors. We all have inherent mental shortcuts that help us make decisions quickly, but they can quietly undermine objectivity, especially in professions built on precision, trust, and ethical responsibility. Joining us is Dr. Victor Go Wang Yu, who has a PhD in applied psychology and is an associate professor from the Department of Psychology as well as the acting dean at Help University in Malaysia. Dr. Go is acknowledged as a respected voice in helping understand how biases like confirmation bias, anchoring, and overconfidence can affect judgment, even in data-driven fields like accounting and finance. We'll explore how these biases show up in everyday work, what professionals need to know about their ethical implications, and how the rise of AI and automation adds a new layer of complexity to decision-making. Welcome, Dr. Go.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tan.
Great. So let's set the table for today's discussion. To begin with, could you explain what cognitive biases are and why they're such a powerful force in how we make decisions in the workplace?
Right. That's a fantastic question. In fact, you've already touched on some of them already, right? When you mentioned anchoring bias, confirmation bias, but basically cognitive biases are a large family of flaws in thinking in psychology that most humans are susceptible to. Now, they're not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, cognitive biases exist because heuristics exist. And heuristics exist because they allow us, our human brains, to process information in a way that's very efficient, that doesn't have to take a lot of time, doesn't have to take a lot of mental resources to come up with relatively valid, relatively accurate answers. And it is these heuristics actually that enables us to go through life, whether in personal relationships or professional careers. And it allows us to process information very efficiently. And it allows us to actually look at the world in a much more simplistic manner. The problem is when heuristics leads us to flawed decision-making. And that's when the heuristic that we have becomes known as a cognitive bias.
Okay, so let's delve into how those heuristics kind of manifest themselves. In your experience, what are some of the most common cognitive biases that show up in high pressure or detail-orientated professions like accounting and finance?
From my experience being a consultant with multiple organizations, especially those in accounting and finance, what we've found most common would be the anchoring bias, confirmation bias, loss aversion as a heuristic, as well as an overconfidence bias. So these are four of the more common ones. If I were to add a fifth one, it will also be the availability heuristic as well. We see this happen a lot, especially in high pressure fields where they feel that they cannot make a mistake. When you cannot make a mistake, that's when confirmation bias, anchoring biases, and availability heuristics come into play much more compared to other professions or other fields where they are more forgiving of mistakes and the pressure is a little bit lower.
Makes sense. You've mentioned confirmation bias a few times, which is often discussed in an accounting context. It's where people seek out information that I guess supports what they already believe. Indeed, I guess it's a bias that algorithms feed on and perpetuate in some ways. But could you explain how this confirmation bias might influence someone's judgment and what the consequences could be at work?
So just to recap, confirmation bias is the tendency for people to look and seek out information that already confirms their pre-existing beliefs. And these kinds of confirmation biases can have severe impacts in work simply because in a confirmation bias perspective, the individual who is under that bias, not only do they seek out information that confirms their belief, but they tend to disregard information, no matter how clear or how well-sourced it is. They tend to disregard information that disproves their own worldview or goes against what they believe to be true. And in a field such as accounting and finance, that can be quite a big issue simply because if you're only looking for what you believe to be true, then you're no longer working based on evidence. You're working based primarily on your perception and primarily based on your own emotions. So it's no longer evidence-based. And in accounting and finance, if you don't operate based on evidence, the consequences could lead to financial losses. And in fact, in some cases, it could also lead to financial fraud. simply because you're disregarding information that you don't believe fits your particular perspective or your particular worldview.
Another one that you mentioned there is anchoring bias, where people rely too heavily on the first piece of information they receive. How does this bias typically affect decision making, and what are some of the ways to counteract it?
So as an applied psychologist, anchoring bias is one of the biggest, most interesting phenomena that we study in the workplace. And anchoring bias is basically the human tendency to pay too much attention to the first number that we hear. And we tend to negotiate or we tend to revolve around that main number that we first hear. And that's why it's called the anchoring bias, because the first number that we hear sort of anchors us to that particular value. And even when we negotiate or even when we look for new data, the new data or the new negotiation revolves around the first number that we hear. So for example, how this works in real life is if let's say you're buying a second-hand car and the salesman has told you that the car is being sold for 20,000 Australian dollars, for example, your counter offer will revolve around that first number that you've heard, which is 20,000 Australian dollars. Instead of counter offering for, let's say, 5,000 Australian dollars, you try to make your counter offer as close as possible to the first number that you are hearing. How does this affect decision making? It affects decision making because, again, similar to other cognitive biases, you're no longer operating based on facts. You're really operating based on a heuristic. Why does this happen? This happens because anchoring gives us a point of reference. And in a world that's not really clear. So a lot of things in our world is not really clear. So for example, how much is the worth of a car? How much is the worth of a coffee? We don't really know how to place value on these things. And that's why the anchoring bias works so well. Because if a coffee used to cost me $3 today, it won't cost me, or it shouldn't cost me $9 tomorrow. It's anchored at $3 already. The problem here is when you're not aware of the anchors that you are using. So if, for example, somebody comes in and they drop an anchor, they drop a value that is way above or way below what the actual value of something is, you tend to then operate around that first number, even if that first number was inaccurate in the first place. And that's dangerous, especially in the world of AI, because the algorithms that AI uses is based on the data that we've fed it. And if our data itself is susceptible to anchoring biases, we are giving wrong information to AI. And that can also lead to a perpetuation of anchoring biases right down the chain.
You can also imagine, when you put it in that context, how central anchoring bias could be in sales tactics.
Exactly. So in fact, a majority of very successful salespeople, so when we do a deep dive and an analysis on their performance, what makes them such a successful salesperson, it's because they understand how the anchoring bias works. And if you meet any successful salesperson, they will never let you drop the anchor first. They will always try to be the first person that throws out that number, because they know that if they throw out that number, it anchors whoever they are talking to around that particular value. And the customer then doesn't deviate too much from that value. So it kind of safeguards their own value proposition as well.
It's a good takeaway for my next negotiation. Now, finance professionals, I guess, often pride themselves on being objective and data-driven, but how can overconfidence bias sneak in, especially among experienced professionals?
I think overconfidence bias is a plague across all professional fields, not just finance and accounting. But in this particular case, it's particularly dangerous simply because the overconfidence bias feeds off the other cognitive biases that we've mentioned earlier. So for example, if you're not aware that you have a tendency towards a confirmation bias, or you're not aware that you've been a victim of an anchoring tactic that's been used against you, then that overconfidence bias that you actually have exacerbates the problem, because you are overconfident. You believe in your ability, your knowledge, the accuracy of your own predictions, the accuracy of your own valuations, but you're not aware that your own knowledge and valuations have been already influenced by a confirmation bias or been influenced by an anchoring bias. So on the grand scheme of things, the overconfidence bias is actually a lot more dangerous simply because it exacerbates the dangers and the harmful effects of all the previous biases that we've already spoken about.
We'll be back with more in just a moment. But first, a quick word about CPA Australia. Are you navigating the ethical use of AI in finance? AI and Ethics for Malaysia is a new micro-credential designed specifically for accounting and finance professionals in Malaysia, featuring expert speakers, case studies, and examples. This course provides a comprehensive exploration of the ethical considerations essential for the responsible use of AI technologies in the workplace. Available now through CPA Australia. The link is in the show notes. Enroll today and lead with confidence. Now, back to our conversation with Dr. Go. So let's talk about some of the interpersonal work environment factors. From a psychological perspective, what role does organisational culture play in either reinforcing or reducing the impact of bias in teams, especially when people are under pressure to meet deadlines or targets?
So that's a great question. And organizational culture plays a huge role. In fact, organizational culture sets the psychological dynamics of the workplace. Several examples I can share from my own experience. For example, if you work in an organizational culture, you work within an organizational culture that's really tense. So they often favor fast decision making. It's always rush deadlines. Then the tendency for the confirmation bias to kick in becomes a lot stronger compared to an organizational culture where they are more relaxed about their timelines. Simply because if it's tense and you are always rushing, you tend to only want information that confirms your point of view because you don't have the time to actually process counter information that goes against your point of view. So that's one example. Another example of how organizational culture can affect your bias is, so one example I could give you when I worked with a Japanese firm was the Japanese culture is very interesting because it's a very collectivistic culture and people tend to not disagree with each other. And that leads to an overconfidence bias because if everybody is agreeing, if everybody's on the same page, people tend to feel that their decisions are definitely correct. So how the Japanese came up with a solution to this is actually quite brilliant. They understood that they have an organizational culture that's very collectivistic. And therefore, in every single meeting, what they would do is they would purposely appoint a devil's advocate. And that person's job is simply to point out mistakes, to point out weaknesses, to point out potential issues with the group's decision making. And that avoids the overconfidence bias, that avoids the confirmation bias, simply because there's one person whose only job is to actually disagree, is to actually point out weaknesses. So these are aspects of organizational cultures that can then affect the impact of bias in your team itself.
It makes sense, doesn't it, to have someone there to play devil's advocate who can sort of guard against that collectivism and make everyone question some of their assumptions.
Yes. And we see this happen a lot in most organizations. So it's not just collectivistic cultures. We see this happen in the US as well. This has happened in Europe as well, especially when you have a really charismatic leader. If you have a very charismatic boss, a very charismatic CEO, it's even more important to understand that the more charismatic your leaders are, the higher the tendency towards confirmation bias, the higher the tendency towards cognitive biases that may exist within the team itself. And how do we combat that? By making sure the structures, the processes are in place.
Yeah, I imagine there's other ways to guard against that as well, which would also help. And I guess diversity is one of them to help guard against groupthink.
Right, you're correct. Diversity of opinions, diversity of backgrounds. People who come from different backgrounds normally have different ways of thinking. So therefore, they are naturally prone to point out issues that may not be as obvious or as salient to others from the same background. So diversity is actually a really great strength that most organizations should leverage on instead of seeing it as just something that they need to do in that sense.
Now, I just want to ask about AI, and the rise of automation and AI in finance has been pretty clear in the last year or two. Everything from algorithmic trading to automated auditing. How might cognitive biases still influence outcomes even when machines are involved? From an ethical standpoint, what are the risks when cognitive biases go unchecked in professions that deal with public trust like accounting and finance? And how can individuals and organizations create accountability around this?
So there are two ways I would say that cognitive biases can still influence outcomes, even with the involvement of machines or AI. And the first way is in what kind of information we are feeding the AI in the first place, because we have to always understand that AIs don't exist in a vacuum. How powerful your AI model is heavily dependent, heavily reliant on the kind of data that you're feeding your AI model. And like I mentioned really briefly earlier, if you're feeding flawed data, if you're feeding data that's already been influenced by the anchoring bias, by the availability heuristic, by the confirmation bias, by a loss aversion bias, if you're feeding those kinds of data into the AI algorithms, then you have to understand that because the data set itself is flawed, the AI can't detect that. And the AI will just give you solutions or recommendations or numbers that are based on flawed data. So that's one major issue that we see already. The quality of the data that you're feeding the AI, that's one major issue. And the second issue, I would say, is because the AI models that we have right now, at least the ones that I'm aware of on the market, suffers from a black box problem. And what is the black box problem? The black box problem is that we don't understand how the AI algorithms came up with their solutions. We don't understand how the AI algorithms came up with their answers, came up with their suggestions. And that's even more dangerous simply because if you don't know how the AI came to those conclusions, then the anchoring heuristic, the anchoring bias becomes even more salient because the AI is just going to suggest to you a number or a particular value, but you have no idea how they came to that value. But that value itself, despite having no logical backing, no scientific backing to that value, you are going to be anchored by that number. So if the AI, for any reason, hallucinates that number and gives you a completely unrealistic number, you are still going to be affected by the anchoring bias based on a completely illogical number. The difference between asking a human and asking an AI for solutions is that at least with the human, you could then question their logic and see how they came up with that number. Whereas with an AI, because of the black box phenomenon, you can't actually question. And that makes the anchoring heuristic a lot more dangerous.
Right, that makes sense then, I guess, the movement towards what I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but glass box AI, so that you can find out where it came from, those biases, and then guard against sort of systemizing those biases.
Yes. But even in the glass box AI, that still doesn't solve the first problem that I mentioned, which is the kind of data sets that you're training it on. And if the data set itself is flawed, even with the glass box AI, you're still going to get wrong answers. You're still going to get answers that have been heavily influenced by cognitive biases, depending on the people who have fed the data into the AI model itself. So when you ask about the ethical standpoint, what are the risks? I believe I've mentioned those risks already. But the second question that you asked, about how can individuals and organizations create accountability around this, I would say the first and most important thing that they can do, companies can do, would be to understand the existence of these kinds of biases. Because if you don't know that they exist, it's very hard to actually guard against them. And secondly, I would say one of the biggest things that we've actually done, at least in our part of the world, is we are trying to reframe how organizations see work output, how organizations embrace failure, how organizations see mistakes. And I think that's really important because if you can reframe how we approach mistakes, we reframe how we see the value of our work, then we are less shoehorned, I would say, or less pressure into not making mistakes. And there's less pressure into coming up with accurate answers. And sometimes it is that pressure to find accurate answers that leads people to rely on AI simply because they believe AI is more accurate than they can be. It also leads people to have these kind of confirmation biases or these kind of availability heuristics simply because they are afraid of making the wrong decisions. They're afraid of coming up with the wrong answers. And we see this happen in organizations quite a bit. Organizations, especially in the US, who are open to failure, tend to come up with a lot more accurate answers, whereas organizations who place an overemphasis on accurate answers tend to come up with a lot of inaccurate answers because of the culture that the expectations have created in that sense.
And to finish, Dr. Go, maybe we can touch on the individuals. What are some practical steps that individuals can take to build awareness of cognitive bias and reduce its impact on decision-making? Are there any tools or habits that you'd recommend?
So some of the habits that I recommend that all professionals should do would be to always bear in mind if everything looks great to you, that's when you should be the most cautious. If every data set seems to confirm your beliefs, that's when you need to be even more cautious. So the idea here is that the world is rarely ideal. And if something really does look ideal, you have to start questioning and saying, am I missing something? Is my perspective too one-sided? That's one of the things that individuals can do to safeguard themselves against cognitive biases. Another fantastic tool to actually safeguard yourself against cognitive biases is to always have a devil's advocate. Because sometimes, no matter how aware you are, there are still blind spots. And if you have the practice of approaching maybe a colleague or a trusted companion and giving them your data, giving them your conclusions, and asking them to critique your data and critique your conclusions, that is one of the most effective ways to uncovering any particular cognitive biases that you may not be aware that you have.
Great advice. That's it for today's episode of In the Black. A big thank you to Dr. Go for helping us unpack the psychology behind cognitive bias and for offering practical insights in how finance professionals can stay objective, ethical, and aware in an increasingly automated world.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Ta. It's a pleasure.
For our listeners eager to learn more, please check out the show notes for links and more information. And don't forget to subscribe to In the Black and share this episode with your colleagues and friends in the business community. Until next time, thanks for listening.
To find out more about our other podcasts, check out the show notes for this episode. And we hope you can join us again next time for another episode of In the Black.